The Whispering Hall. The University of Crestwood was a sprawling, picturesque campus. With its towering Gothic buildings, ivy-clad walls, and pristine quads, it felt like something out of a brochure. But underneath the polished veneer lay something much darker, a history that most students brushed off as nothing more than urban legends. Talia, Mark, Jody, and David had been friends since freshman year, bonding over late-night study sessions and long weekends spent in the dorms. Now in their senior year, they had heard their fair share of campus ghost stories. The most infamous of them all centered around Ashcroft Hall, an abandoned dormitory at the far end of campus. The building had been closed for nearly 20 years, ever since a series of strange accidents and suicides claimed the lives of several students. "Alright, guys, I've got an idea for tonight," Mark said one Friday evening as they sat in their usual spot in the campus cafe. Oh, Jody groaned. "Whenever you say that, we end up doing something ridiculous." Mark grinned. "It's Halloween weekend. We're going ghost hunting." David rolled his eyes. "Not this again." "No, hear me out," Mark insisted, leaning in closer. "Ashcroft Hall. We go in, check the place out, and see if any of those ghost stories are actually true." Talia raised an eyebrow. "You mean break into the most haunted building on campus? The one security patrols every night?" "Yeah, that sounds like a solid plan." "Come on," Mark pressed. "It's our last year. We've got to do something memorable, right? And besides, it's probably just a bunch of nonsense. We'll go in, take some pictures, scare ourselves silly, and leave." Jody shivered. "I don't know, Mark. That place gives me the creeps." David leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "If we get caught, we're screwed. Campus security's not gonna let us off easy." Mark smirked. "That's why we won't get caught. We sneak in after midnight, when the patrols are lighter. Just think about it, a legendary haunted building, Halloween weekend, and a night we'll never forget." Talia sighed, exchanging a glance with Jody. As much as the idea made her uncomfortable, she had to admit it had a certain appeal. She wasn't usually the type to get caught up in ghost stories, but the idea of spending one last adventure with her friends before graduation tugged at her. "Fine," Talia said. "But if anything weird happens, I'm out." David chuckled. "Same here. The moment something spooky goes down, I'm running." Mark grinned. "Deal. So it's settled. Tonight, we're going ghost hunting." At a little past midnight, the four of them stood in front of Ashcroft Hall. The building loomed before them, its windows dark and broken, its stone facade weathered by decades of neglect. Vines crawled up the walls, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. "This place looks even worse up close," Jody muttered, hugging her arms to her chest. David clicked his flashlight on, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Let's just get this over with." They circled around to the back of the building, where Mark had scouted out a broken window large enough to climb through. With a few muttered complaints, they hoisted themselves inside, one by one. The inside of Ashcroft was even more unsettling than the outside. The air was stale and musty, and the floor creaked ominously under their feet. Old furniture was strewn about, and graffiti covered the walls. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by their flashlights. "Alright, let's split up and cover more ground," Mark suggested. "No way," Jody said quickly. "We stick together." Fine, Mark said, holding his hands up in surrender. "We'll stick together." They made their way through the first floor, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The further they went, the heavier the atmosphere seemed to grow. "Does anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Talia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David nodded. "Yeah. This place is off." Suddenly, they heard a faint noise, a whisper, soft and barely audible, coming from down the hall. "Did you hear that?" Jody whispered, her eyes wide. "Probably just the wind," Mark said, though he didn't sound convinced. The whisper came again, this time clearer. It was as if someone, or something, was speaking just beyond their reach. The sound sent a chill down Talia's spine. "Okay, I've had enough," David said, backing up toward the entrance. "Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, they heard a loud bang behind them, like a door slamming shut. They froze. "What the hell was that?" Jody gasped. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Maybe it's just the building settling." But none of them believed it. The sound had been too deliberate, too sudden. Without another word, they hurried back toward the window they had climbed through. But as they reached it, they found the way blocked boards that hadn't been there before covered the window, nailed firmly in place. "Mark, what the hell?" Talia hissed. "You said we could get out." "I don't understand." Mark stammered. "The window was open when we came in." The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the halls. "It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been there." "We need to find another way out," David said, his voice shaking. They turned and ran deeper into the building, the whispers growing louder, more insistent. The hall seemed to twist and change around them, as if the building itself was alive, shifting to trap them inside. "This can't be happening," Jody muttered, her voice barely audible. But it was happening, and there was no escape. Chapter 2: The Unseen Presence. They ran down the corridor, flashlights bouncing as their panic rose. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more distinct with every step. What had started as faint, unintelligible murmurs were now clear voices, dozens of them, overlapping and blending together, creating a cacophony of disembodied speech. It felt as though invisible eyes were tracking their every move. "Where the hell are we going?" Talia shouted, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark, leading the way, skidded to a stop at the end of the corridor. The hallway split off into two directions, but both paths were equally dark and foreboding. "Right or left?" he asked, desperation creeping into his voice. "Left!" Jody cried, already turning. The others followed, plunging down the narrow hallway, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence that followed the voices. But as they turned the corner, they found themselves standing at a dead end, a heavy, locked door. "Shit!" David yelled, slamming his fist against the door in frustration. "Calm down," Talia said, though her voice wavered. "We just need to think. There has to be another way out." Mark swung his flashlight across the room, revealing old lockers lining the walls and a boarded-up window high above them. The room reeked of mold and dust, and the oppressive weight of the unseen presence pressed down on them. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. The absence of the voices left a suffocating void in the air, and the group stood frozen, afraid to move or even breathe. Then, from behind them, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. "Someone's coming," Jody whispered, her eyes wide with terror. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. Mark pointed his flashlight down the corridor they had come from, but the beam revealed nothing, just the long, empty hallway. "Who's there?" David shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response, just the slow, steady sound of footsteps, moving toward them. "We're trapped!" Talia cried, her voice rising in panic. "There's nowhere to go." As the footsteps drew nearer, the lights in their flashlights flickered, then dimmed. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, almost tangible, as if it were wrapping itself around them. Then, in the faint glow of the dying flashlight, they saw it, a shadow, not cast by any object, but standing alone in the hallway, just out of reach of the light. It was tall, humanoid, but wrong, its form shifted and wavered as though it were made of smoke. "Oh my God," Jody whimpered, stepping back. Mark dropped the flashlight in his panic, and the light went out, plunging them into total darkness. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound, no light, just the suffocating blackness. Then the whispers returned, louder and closer than ever. This time, they carried with them a sense of urgency, like 1,000 voices pleading for something. And then, in the darkness, came a voice unlike the others. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice. "Get out!" The group didn't need any more encouragement. They ran blindly down the hall, crashing into walls and doors as they searched for an exit. Chapter 3: The Vanishing. Jody was the first to disappear. In the chaos of their blind flight, they had somehow become separated. One moment, Jody had been right behind David, her hand gripping his jacket, and the next, she was gone. It happened in a heartbeat, as if the darkness itself had swallowed her whole. "Jody!" David shouted, his voice echoing through the empty hallways. "Jody, where are you?" But there was no response. The only sound was the echo of his voice bouncing off the crumbling walls. Mark and Talia stopped beside him, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. "Where the hell did she go?" Talia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," David shouted. "She was right behind me." The whispers surged again, louder this time, as if mocking them. They could hear the disjointed voices all around them, overlapping and mixing together, creating a disorienting, maddening chorus. "This is insane," Mark muttered, running a hand through his hair. "We have to find her." But the more they searched, the more hopeless it seemed. Ashcroft Hall was a maze, its hallways twisting and turning in impossible ways, leading them back to places they had already been. It was as though the building itself was playing with them, trapping them in its endless corridors. They called Jody's name again and again, but the only answer was the relentless whispering, growing louder with every passing minute. After what felt like hours, they stumbled into a large, open room, a former common area, judging by the remnants of old furniture scattered around. The walls were covered in more graffiti, but this time, the messages were chilling. "Get out. They watch. You will never leave." Talia backed away, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to go. Now." "But Jody," David began. "She's gone." Talia snapped, tears streaming down her face. "We'll never find her in this place. We have to leave before we end up like her." Mark hesitated, torn between his instinct to find their friend and the overwhelming sense of dread that was telling him to run. But before he could decide, something strange happened. The whispers stopped again, just as suddenly as they had before. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. And then, from the darkness, came the sound of a door creaking open. Chapter 4, The Final Warning. The door was just ahead, barely visible in the gloom. It was old and wooden, its paint peeling and worn with age. As it creaked open, it revealed a narrow staircase leading down into the basement. "Are you kidding me?" David muttered. "A basement? In a haunted building?" Talia shook her head. "No. Absolutely not. We're not going down there." But the alternative was worse. Behind them, the shadows seemed to be moving, swirling and creeping closer, as if the darkness itself was alive. The whispers had returned, low and menacing, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. "We don't have a choice," Mark said, his voice shaking. "We can't stay here." Without waiting for a response, he stepped toward the door and began descending the staircase. David followed, and after a moment of hesitation, Talia did too. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step echoing in the stillness. The air grew colder as they descended, and the oppressive feeling of being watched only intensified. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with old pipes, and the floor was damp and slick. A single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This feels like a terrible idea," Talia whispered. "Just keep moving," Mark said, though his voice was strained. "We'll find a way out." They walked down the hallway in silence, their footsteps echoing in the cold, damp air. The further they went, the more the walls seemed to close in around them, as though the building itself was trying to crush them. And then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere ahead. "Do you hear that?" David whispered. Mark nodded. "Yeah. What is it?" The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it was echoing all around them. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, and coming closer. "We need to go back," Talia said, panic rising in her voice. But when they turned to retreat, they found the staircase had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of stone. "We're trapped," Mark whispered, his face pale. The footsteps were louder now, almost deafening. They came from the darkness ahead, a slow, methodical rhythm that sent chills down their spines. And then, from the shadows, they saw a figure, tall and twisted, its face obscured by the darkness. It stepped forward, its body moving in unnatural, jerky motions, as though it didn't quite know how to walk. "Run," Talia whispered. They turned and fled, their footsteps pounding against the cold stone floor. The figure followed, its footsteps echoing behind them, growing louder and closer with every passing second. They ran blindly through the labyrinth of hallways, the whispers surrounding them, taunting them, laughing at their fear. Finally, they burst through a door and found themselves back in the main building, their hearts racing and their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But as they looked around, they realized something horrifying. They were standing in the exact same spot where they had started. The building had brought them full circle. And the figure was still following. Chapter 1: The Quiet House. The house was far too quiet. Emma had never minded being alone. In fact, she relished it. Living in a small suburban neighborhood, she enjoyed her peaceful life. Her parents had gone on a weekend trip, leaving her in charge of the house, which wasn't a big deal. She was 21 and perfectly capable of handling a few days by herself. But tonight, something felt different. The usual comforting silence had turned eerie, and the familiar sounds of the house settling seemed unusually loud. Emma sat on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. The house was large, a two-story structure with creaky floorboards and long hallways that seemed to stretch out in the dark. Emma had grown up here, so the noises should have been normal: pipes clanking, wind against the windows, but tonight, each sound seemed more sinister than usual. It didn't help that the power had flickered off earlier in the evening, just for a few seconds, before coming back. That brief moment of pitch darkness had set her nerves on edge, and even now, hours later, she hadn't fully shaken the feeling. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, the only sound breaking the silence. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows. Maybe I should go to bed early, she thought, but something held her back. The thought of turning off the lights, of lying in her room with the house so still, was strangely terrifying. She tried to tell herself she was being ridiculous, that nothing was wrong, but her gut told her otherwise. She finally put her phone down and stood up. She'd make sure everything was locked up tight, double-check the doors, windows, and make sure the alarm system was on. That would give her some peace of mind. As she walked through the house, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she turned a corner or entered a room, she expected to see someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the soft creaking of the house. She checked the front door. Locked. She moved to the back sliding glass door, also locked. The windows were secure. She was safe. But the uneasy feeling didn't leave her. As she turned to head upstairs, she heard a faint creak from above her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Was someone upstairs? Her parents' room was right above her, and though the sound could have been the house settling, it had been so distinct, so deliberate. No one's upstairs, she told herself. It's just your imagination. But the sound came again, another creak, this time louder. Emma grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. She opened the flashlight app and shined the light toward the staircase. The beam illuminated the narrow wooden steps, casting long shadows on the walls. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "Is anyone there?" There was no response. The only sound was the wind howling outside, growing more intense as the night wore on. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to climb the stairs. The thought of going up there alone terrified her, but she couldn't just ignore the noise. She had to make sure there was nothing there. Step by step, she ascended, the flashlight beam trembling as her hands shook. When she reached the top, she hesitated, listening for any further sound. Silence. She checked her parents' bedroom. It was empty, just as she had expected, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there moments before. She backed out of the room and checked the guest room, then her own. Everything was as it should be. Just as she was about to convince herself that she was imagining things, her phone buzzed in her hand, causing her to jump. She glanced down at the screen. An unknown number. A text message. "Are you alone?" Emma stared at the screen, her heart hammering in her chest. It had to be a prank, right? Someone messing with her. But how would they know? She quickly typed back, "Who is this?" No response. Her heart raced as she walked back downstairs, every nerve on edge. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her phone buzzed again. Another text. "I'm inside." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty living room, the dark corners of the hallway. No, she thought. This is a joke. Someone's messing with me. But her gut told her otherwise. Suddenly, the power flickered, the lights dimming for just a second before going out completely. She was plunged into darkness, her only source of light the dim glow of her phone. Her hands shaking, she typed back quickly, "This isn't funny." "Who are you?" No response. She moved toward the kitchen, trying to steady her breathing. She grabbed a knife from the drawer, holding it tightly in her hand. The silence was suffocating now, broken only by her own panicked breaths and the distant sound of the wind howling outside. Her phone buzzed again. Another text. "Look behind you." Emma's blood ran cold. Chapter 2, The Stranger. Emma didn't turn around. She couldn't. Her body had frozen in place, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to flee the house and never look back, but fear kept her rooted to the spot. "Look behind you." The words on the screen seemed to mock her, taunting her with a terror she couldn't face. She squeezed the knife in her hand, the cold metal biting into her palm. Slowly, almost mechanically, she forced herself to turn around. The living room was empty. There was no one behind her. No shadowy figure, no lurking stranger. Just the same empty space she had seen a dozen times tonight. But somehow, the emptiness made it worse. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm waiting." Emma's heart lurched as she backed away from the living room. Whoever was texting her knew exactly where she was, knew her movements, and was watching her. But where were they? She checked the windows, none of them had been tampered with. The doors were locked. There was no way anyone could have gotten inside. But the messages kept coming. She retreated to the kitchen, gripping the knife so hard her knuckles turned white. Her mind raced, trying to think of what to do. Should she call the police? Would they even believe her? She hadn't actually seen anyone, and she was alone in the house. For all she knew, it could be a cruel prank. Her phone buzzed again, another message lighting up the screen. "Come upstairs." Emma's breath hitched in her throat. She stared at the screen, trying to comprehend the words. Why would they want her to go upstairs? It's a trick, she thought. They want to lure me up there. But what if there was something upstairs? What if this was more than just a sick joke? She hesitated, glancing up toward the dark staircase. Her pulse quickened as she debated what to do. Running out of the house seemed like the smart option, but her feet wouldn't move. The thought of leaving, of running out into the night alone, terrified her even more than the possibility of someone being inside the house with her. Her phone buzzed again. "I can hear you breathing." Emma gasped, slapping a hand over her mouth. She couldn't take it anymore. She bolted from the kitchen, her footsteps echoing through the silent house as she ran toward the front door. She fumbled with the lock, her shaking hands struggling to turn the deadbolt. Just as she finally unlocked the door and yanked it open, her phone buzzed again. "Don't leave." Without thinking, she slammed the door shut and locked it again. Panic surged through her as she realized her mistake. She was trapped. She had let the fear control her, and now she was back inside, right where the stranger wanted her. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm upstairs now." Emma's blood turned to ice. She glanced up at the dark staircase, half expecting to see someone standing at the top, watching her. But the staircase was empty. She needed to get out. Now. With trembling hands, she opened her phone and dialed 911. The ringing seemed to last forever, each second stretching out like an eternity. Finally, a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? Emma's voice shook as she spoke. Someone's in my house. They're texting me. I don't know where they are, but they're inside. Ma'am, are you safe right now? I don't know. I think they're upstairs. I'm by the front door, but... Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her heart stopping as she read the message. They can't help you. Emma's hand tightened around the phone. Please, send someone. I don't know what to do. We're sending an officer to your location now. Stay on the line with me. Is the person inside your house armed? I don't know. I haven't seen them. They've just been sending me messages. Okay, try to stay calm. Are all your doors locked? Yes, but... Suddenly, there was a loud creak from upstairs. Emma froze, her eyes wide with terror as she heard slow, deliberate footsteps on the floor above her.
If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.